Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to this series with Benefits Data Trust. I am Trooper Sanders, the CEO of Benefits Data Trust. As many of you all know, we are a national nonprofit that is working to ensure that people who need help and are eligible for benefits can tap them with ease and dignity. And we spend our time working with many extraordinary public servants and others across the country who people rely on to get help when they need it. As you all know, artificial intelligence has been something that has been around for decades, but that has popped in the news and the public consciousness over the past several months. And it seems that you really can't turn without hearing something about generative AI this or ChatGPT that, or what are some of the questions around bias and other issues related to AI. And leaders in many sectors, and the human services sector, no doubt, are grappling with what does AI mean, number one, what does it mean for their sectors and their work, and how should they navigate the many choices and decisions that they will have to make. And we hope that these series of conversations with extraordinary national leaders will help you gain some interesting insight and perspective to be able to do what you do in leading your agencies and ensuring that whether or not AI is used, that the people you serve are served as effectively as possible. Today, I am pleased to be joined by one of my favorite people, favorite scholars, and favorite experts in the AI space, Dr. Karen Levy. Karen, hello.
Hi, Trooper. I'm so glad to be with you.
Wonderful. Well, could you just say just a little bit about your background just before we jump in?
Yeah, sure. I am a faculty member in the Department of Information Science at Cornell University. Information science, nobody really knows what that means, but it's basically the study of technology and people, so different ways in which technology intersects with society and with people's decisions. And my background is in sociology and in law, so those were the degrees that I got prior to coming here.
That sounds like a lot of reading and reading and reading in school. Well, to start with, how do you define artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question when you posted. I think, there's a sort of endless debate, I think, that people engage in about characterizing AI in different ways technically, or distinguishing between AIs versus machine learning versus algorithmic systems versus automated systems. And the terminology that I've sort of settled on in my own research is to sort of get around some of the technical questions are just data intensive systems. I think what's most important about the kinds of systems that I work on are two things. One is that by data intensive, I mean that they're drawing on lots of different data inputs that are new, right? And that sometimes can have a whole lot of implications for people, either because that data collection can be quite intrusive, or it can be done without consent, or it can require a fair amount of surveillance over people, but that set of inputs is really critical. And then the other component, I think, is that those systems are being used to make decisions about people or generate predictions about what they'll do in the future, or make inferences about things that like risks that they might pose. And that those decisions and those predictions are quite meaningful and consequential to people. So I think those are kind of the features of the technologies that a lot of people use the term AI to kind of as a shorthand to refer to those kinds of tools.
I got to know your work through your study of the trucking industry, which I'm not sure there are many people who would make a natural connection between artificial intelligence and the truck driver. But tell us why.
Yeah, I've had to answer that question for a lot of people over the years. I think you're right. It's not a natural connection you might immediately think of. But truckers are a really, really interesting group of really essential workers, right? We like to talk a lot about essential workers these days, but truckers are really about as essential as it gets to the way the economy functions and the way we all get the food and clothes and medicine and really every other thing that you have in your house or on your body. They just touch all of it, right? They're really critical. Basically they're the infrastructure on which the country runs, but they're generally kind of an unseen population. The long haul drivers, who are the drivers that I focused on studying, there's about 2 million of them. And even though they're really critical to the work to the economy, they're not people we tend to think about a lot. But new technologies and AI in particular have had just a drastic effect on the way they do their work, on their lives, on the way they interact with managers. And I got to know a little bit about kind of what that technology was doing in trucking over the last 10 or 15 years. And I started talking to truck drivers just on, quite honestly, just on a whim, just because they seemed like an interesting group of people. And I was hooked immediately. They were so generous to me. And I really wanted to sort of tell the stories of these low wage workers who we need so much and whose work was being really upended in a lot of ways by these tools. I also think truckers are, interesting in their own right, but they're also a bit of a canary in a coal mine for how to think about low wage workers and other vulnerable populations that are impacted by these systems when systems are implemented without regard for maybe the social or economic realities that these folks are facing, which is definitely what's happened in the trucking context, and I think happens much more broadly across lots of different contexts.
If you were advising a leader of a human service organization, be it a government agency or a nonprofit, as they are thinking about the role of AI as a workforce tool, what would you say to them in terms of AI and thinking about their frontline workers and others?
Yeah, I think one of the first things to recognize is that in a lot of different contexts, AI seems really new and shiny, right? And we pay a lot of attention to it and talk about it in these ways that make it seem like something just over the horizon, or just beginning to influence the way we work or the way we manage people. But a lot of what AI is being used to do is kind of like part of this long tail of things that managers and firms have tried to do for a really long time, right? Like improve efficiency, increase productivity, improve safety, some of which are like clearly quite laudable goals, right? Or things that we expect good managers to be able to do. And sometimes AI is just like another tool that's being used towards these goals that already exist. But AI can also change the game in some ways that I think are really critically important. In the trucking context, like one of the ways in which that happens that I mentioned is, this sort of hunger for data that AI systems tend to engender, right? So as we begin to draw on more different types of data, behavioral data in the trucking context, things like scans of people's faces to determine how fatigued they are, looking at people's eyelids to determine if they're fluttering, lots of biometric information, pretty intrusive, information in some workplace contexts about, people's personal social media profiles or the things they're doing in their off hours, right? Lots of different workplace contexts, you see this kind of influx of new data that really sort of blurs the line between what we think of as the workplace and what we think of as workers' lives more generally. And I think it's really critical to keep in mind that these systems, and just by their nature, tend to engender that kind of hunger for these new kinds of data, and that they can allow us to make inferences, whether those inferences are accurate or not, that kind of can change the relationships between managers and workers. And so in the trucking context, a lot of my work is looking at kind of ways in which the head knowledge, right, or the things that people know from experience on the job or from being in a certain context, or in my case, being on the road, right, that can really get upended or get replaced by a type of knowledge that's more abstracted or that's predictive, right, which is something that's kind of, something managers have on their screens, right, and that there can sometimes be a real conflict between those two different forms of expertise.
I was struck in your work when you discussed how the automation of some of the management practices really almost hurt the dignity of truckers who joined the industry, who became truckers with a certain sense of who they were as professionals, and how the automation kind of upended and disrupted that. And I think for human service leaders, people join human service agencies with a sense of themselves as professionals, et cetera. What are some of the context and lessons from that they should think about?
Yeah, I noticed when you used the word dignity earlier, like that really stuck out to me for that reason too, right? I think, we very naturally, when we talk about things like AI and employment, right, or AI in the workforce, there's a tendency to think about the effects of AI as being about the number of jobs that are going to be lost, right? Like you see all kinds of headlines all the time about, what jobs will the robots take next, right? And we think a lot about this sort of top line economic figures, and that's really important. I don't want to suggest that we shouldn't be paying attention to those things, but that allows us to maybe not pay attention to things that are less quantifiable, like the dignity and quality of work, right? So in trucking, for example, a lot of people kind of talked about the idea that autonomous vehicle technology would just take truckers' jobs away, right? And in the book, I go into a bunch of depth about why I don't really think that's going to happen anytime soon. I think we'll have human truckers for quite a while going forward. But what's really critical is that what that work looks like will be really different, right? Because suddenly truckers are dealing with this much more intrusive technology that's in their face or that's on their body, right? And they still have their jobs, but the nature of the dignity that the work that they do, or the autonomy they have to make decisions for themselves, is really affected. And that matters, partly just because maybe you think dignity matters, and partly because if you want to retain an experienced workforce, the people who are most likely to leave are often the people who've been doing something for the longest and have built up the most expertise by virtue of having done that job for a long time. And those are the people, in my experience, who really, really kind of bristle under the forms of oversight that these systems sometimes require.
So you, as mentioned earlier, you have not only a law degree, but a doctorate in sociology. And I think probably many of the leaders of human service organizations followed your academic path, and perhaps were not computer science majors or got their advanced degrees in engineering, and now find the AI file on their desk, or finding themselves in conversations steeped in matters of code when their training might have been more in prose. What would you say to them about how they find their way in these AI conversations, and do they have a right place at the table?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that people who have sociological expertise or expertise about allocation of resources or working with government or understanding a lot, in a deep way about the circumstances that people face in their everyday lives, that those forms of knowledge are absolutely indispensable to building tools that actually work for people. There's no way of building or understanding these systems that doesn't require integrating tech. You do need, of course, some technical knowledge, right? And not everyone has to have all of the different kinds of knowledge in their head, but you need technical team members, but you definitely need people who have political expertise, social expertise, policy expertise. There's kind of a stereotype sometimes that engineers or computer scientists, might not recognize the other forms of expertise or other forms of knowledge other than their own, or that the disciplines can be a little bit hegemonic. I'll say that in my own experience, maybe I'm just surrounding myself with the right kinds of people, but I really have not found that stereotype to hold true. I find that my students, especially, I teach a lot of kind of upcoming students who are trying to learn how to be data scientists and want to put their skills, to positive use. And those students and my colleagues at Cornell, I think, really recognize that doing good requires some humility, right, about what your toolkit can get you, and that you have to sort of cross-pollinate with these other forms of expertise. So I think, folks who are coming from kind of my team, or, the more social science side of things, I think there's absolutely a huge role for those folks to play.
Great. And what is the one question that you would suggest human service leaders ask when an AI matter comes across their desk, or they're sitting in a strategy conversation where AI comes up?
Yeah, I really love this question. I think the way I have tended to think about it is, if AI is being proposed to solve a problem, what problem is not being solved by the use of AI, or what problem are we avoiding by potentially using AI? So to maybe expand on that a little bit, like in the context of the trucking workforce, there's a big problem with fatigue, right? People are overworked and they're underpaid. And so we've deployed AI to kind of monitor people and make sure that they're safe, right? That's fine, right? Fatigue's a real problem, and you could see why somebody might say, well, let's use a technical tool to address this problem. But really, the reason people are so tired, right, the root cause of that problem is economic, right? It has to do with the wage structure of the industry. It has to do with legal exemptions, right? It's like a complicated economic, social, political story. And pasting a technology on that, like as a sort of a Band-Aid, isn't addressing those root problems, right? There's no way in which it can do that. And I think that's often the case, that we often sort of turn to technical tools in contexts that are resource constrained because someone has decided to allocate resources in that way, like in education or healthcare or the criminal justice system, right? Other contexts where we're kind of trying to make do with what we've got. And of course, like sometimes that's the political reality, and using a technical tool, I think, can certainly be part of a broader system of reform. Like without doubt, I think there's a role for AI in all of those systems. but it's also important to see what turning to AI allows us to not do, right? And sometimes it's something that's politically a lot harder, but that I think is really critical if we want to address economic problems or social problems in a real way.
And then finally, please tell people the name of your book and the documentary that's coming out. But then two, what other favorite book, podcast, article, or other resource would you suggest that people go to read or consume to get their heads around AI?
I loved this question. I've made a really long list, and I'll spare you the long list. But my book is called Data-Driven Truckers, Technology, and the New Workplace Surveillance. It's a Princeton University Press book, and it came out about 6 months ago. And then the other book that I would recommend, there's a book I absolutely love called The Fires, and it's by a journalist named Joe Flood. I don't know if you know this book, Trooper. It came out maybe like 10 or 15 years ago. It's the story of how in the 1960s and 1970s, New York City turned to the Rand Corporation and to other consultants to build models to decide where to locate fire stations in the city. So it really is, about human services. And the story, I won't spoil it for you, but it's basically a disaster because the choices that the technocrats make without kind of regard for the local knowledge that folks on the ground have end up cutting services really exclusively to the poorest neighborhoods in New York City. And then the Bronx is burning and you get all these terrible consequences. And it's such a beautiful story. It's really well written. It's really exciting. But it also, I think, reminds us that these are not new problems, right? Like these are the policy poles that people have dealt with for a really long time, right? To what extent do you want centralized governance or some centralized way of doing things? And to what extent do you want to pull from local knowledge and context? And I think those are just always going to be things that we have to navigate between. But I think that book, The Fires by Joe Flood, is such a beautiful encapsulation of how those things happen on the ground.
You have given me one additional book to add to my bookcase.
Oh, good.
Dr. Karen Levy, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Really nice to talk to you.